Hey guys, it's Amanda from the Farmer's Daughter USA. I recently had the opportunity to chat with Dillon Honcoop from Save Family Farming. That is a Washington state based organization. They do a lot of advocacy work for farmers, agriculture in general, and they've been pretty big proponents of agriculture on some fairly controversial issues. Dylan and I chatted about the overtime exemption in Washington state for agricultural workers. I wrote about it earlier this year for my Ag Daily piece. I'll put a link into the video description so you can see it. But essentially, it was a decision by the Washington State Supreme Court that struck down the overtime exemption for farm workers. While that was one thing, the thing that was maybe worse is the fact that the court left open the door for farm workers to essentially sue their employers for the last 3 years worth of overtime pay. So although the farmers had been following the law, they were paying their workers according to the law, this decision came back and said, no, you should have been paying overtime. And oh, by the way, your employees can get retroactive overtime. So it was a kind of a big deal because that could have added up to a lot of money for a lot of farmers. And potentially, quite frankly, it could have put a lot of them out of business. So anyway, after that decision, there was a lot of lobbying and discussions with the state legislature, and a new law has been passed now. So that's what I wanted to chat with Dillon about and get his perspective and see how this is affecting farmers in Washington. Yeah, and I appreciate that you're doing that work. I think, at least from the farmers I know from Washington state, it feels like you're constantly bombarded with legislation and policy that is just not good. And that's actually what we're going to talk about today. I wrote about this, I think a few months ago now. I assume nobody read that article. But there's this overtime exemption issue. There was a lawsuit that kind of started getting the ball rolling, and then everything completely went just to chaos. So just give everybody a background on exactly what happened and how this got started.
Well, this case has been brewing for some time. I don't remember the exact timeline, but it's been a couple of years ago. As you well know, things take time to work through the legal system. And but a class action lawsuit was filed against a Washington state dairy. Workers saying that there were a variety of claims that were being made, but the most significant for the rest of the dairy community here in Washington and beyond potentially was that the overtime exemption that Washington state has, they said, was unconstitutional, that workers should be paid time and a half over 40 hours a week, essentially. So they were saying that was a problem. And they were also demanding back pay then for up to the statute of limitations. 3 years back, they were saying they were denied this, extra half of the time and a half for those 3 years. So that's what they were asking for. And we were kind of following this off and on. It wasn't really clear how the Washington State Supreme Court would rule as it, made it up to that level. Again, the slow process of the courts. But then in early November of last year, the Washington State Supreme Court, while they didn't necessarily rule in favor or agree with, I guess, all of the arguments or the reasons why the activist groups and others who were behind that class action lawsuit, the reasons why they said, people should be afforded time and a half in agriculture, they still did rule that they believed the Washington state exemption, which of course there's the federal, exemption. There are other, states have their own. They ruled the Washington state exemption was unconstitutional. And from that point forward, that immediately affected dairy farming, right? Because it was a dairy farm that the ruling was about. Parts of the case were arguments that dairy farming was extremely dangerous. There was, arguments about, racism and things like that, again, that the court didn't ultimately end up agreeing with, but it was a whole ball of wax, right, of pretty hot button issues on this. And so the court at that point, because of that ruling, basically made it happen for dairy, where over 40 hours a week, time and a half was being paid, and anybody who knew anything about their legal liability was paying that right away. The question at that point was, what about the rest of, all the other farming sectors here in Washington State? Pretty diverse state as far as different crops and farming sectors. How would it affect them? And the assumption is that they would probably have, because of that state Supreme Court ruling, a pretty strong case then to go to other industries, other sectors, and make an argument to do away with the overtime in those, the overtime exemption in those sectors. The other part of this that was so immediately concerning and potentially devastating was, while the state Supreme Court didn't specifically answer the question on the back pay, like I said, they had been requesting back pay up to the 3 years, saying they'd been denied, rightful pay. The court didn't answer that question directly, but it was left open enough that immediately what we've been calling echo lawsuits were filed. And by the time it was said and done, over 30 different class action lawsuits were filed against multiple dairies primarily, but other farms as well across the state. Some operations had multiple lawsuits filed against them, all demanding back pay. This was going to be the mechanism that, whether it was activists or workers or whoever was involved, primarily what we like to call the litigation industry here in Washington State, was they were seeing the dollar signs here, right? There was a huge opportunity, so all they had to do was file these suits and cross their fingers that they would be able to argue for this back pay. Most of that would be soaked up in massive legal fees. Small amounts would go to workers. The total bill to the farming community here in Washington State would be in the many millions, over $100 million just for dairy. Could have been as high as $2 billion or more if it ended up applying to all farming in Washington State. So that was the major threat that we were facing as we went into the legislative session that started in January. And that's where a state senator stepped in to say, hey, I'm going to, bring forward this bill that would essentially straightforward stop these echo lawsuits. Say farmers were following the law. There was an exemption to overtime on the books here in Washington State up until that ruling. Farmers should not be liable to pay back this money that they were not legally required to in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's that whole issue. I mean, I think, if people want to have a conversation about whether ag should be paying overtime to their workers, fine, we can have that conversation. We can talk about why they may or may not, that might not be a good idea. But this idea that you have been following the law, you've been doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, you're taking care of your workers as the law tells you have to. And now you have the state Supreme Court saying, oh no, wait a second. You've got to go back 3 years now, figure out what that overtime amount would have been and pay that to your employees. And it just feels so fundamentally unfair that they would have.
Well, and at that point, the state Supreme Court, to be fair, hadn't said that specifically, but they had left that question open and unanswered. Again, you know how this works in the court system. When a question is unanswered, then the wheels of justice, or I believe injustice in this case, continue to turn until you get an answer to that question. A couple of there were a few different opinions. There was a majority opinion, a dissenting opinion, and some other opinions from state Supreme Court justices on this issue. A couple of justices had spoken or written favorably about this back pay concept, which didn't bode well for the possibility. After the state Supreme Court, though, was going to be remanded to the local courts in Yakima to hash that out. And so that was one of the initial arguments that was made in the state legislatures. Well, the courts still have to iron this out. We can't, as a legislature, act on this issue. And, the legal minds looking after the rights and the future of farmers are saying, no, that's not the case at all here. In fact, you do need to rule on this. And ultimately, on the practical side, not a legal argument necessarily, but if you don't do something about this now, cases will be filed and that ship will have sailed. It'll be too late if we wait beyond this session here in 2021 to get an answer on this issue. What ensued in the Washington state legislature was bizarre, to say the least. I don't know how much you followed it, Amanda, but as you mentioned earlier, we face a lot of challenges here in Washington state. It's a very deep blue state. It very much likes to follow the lead of California and Oregon. A lot of progressive ideology in our state legislature. So, some things that you and I might view as pretty common sense didn't even seem to cross these folks' mind. As we can get into the overtime just itself, how it doesn't necessarily jive with the natural world that farming exists in and all of that. But as far as the fundamental fairness and constitutionality of having to pay back pay, be penalized when you were following the law, it just kind of blew our minds where it went, because like I said, this bill was introduced to essentially get that out of committee and keep that bill alive ahead of the deadlines that it faced. There were negotiations, compromises that needed to be made at one point where the bill would essentially do almost the opposite of what it was introduced to do, which would have said basically, and this is where the opponents of this concept said, okay, we'll let this bill go forward and we'll say no to these lawsuits if the state basically comes in and collects full back pay plus 12% interest, puts it all in an escrow account, and gives the state 6 years to find everybody who is theoretically owed this money, which, if you can imagine, it's just a bookkeeping nightmare to even figure that out. Who was working where at what time? How many hours did they put in? How many of those hours were actually over 40 hours a week? And then how does that, and this is a workforce that can be transient. People are moving jobs, moving states, countries even. It was just mind-boggling how complex it was going to be, which just added to the potential liability for the farming community on this. So thankfully, that was just a negotiating point at that time. And then the work continued from there to where the agreement was, okay, as long as farming as a whole, not just dairy, which was already paying time and a half, already presumably under that rule or law, I guess, as the court, in my view, legislated from the bench. But as long as the rest of, go ahead.
Farmers, once they got that ruling, dairy they switched over. They're paying overtime at that point.
They were done. Yep.
Everybody that maybe isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And Washington is famous, for instance, for its apples. The tree fruit industry is very, very big here. So they stood to lose a lot of money and face a huge amount of headaches. A lot of farms could have and would have gone out of business had this gone forward the way the activist groups were pushing it. And so the agreement ultimately was, okay, we'll agree to a phase-in of a time and a half rule or law or whatever we want to call it over the next 3 years, as a threshold would work down each year of when this time and a half pay would start. And as a part of that, then the agreement on the other side would be to essentially nullify or make impossible all of these back pay lawsuits that would have been so immediately devastating. Obviously, the burden of overtime, and not to mention the added bureaucracy and complications, will be financially, economically devastating to farming over the long term. But it was that immediate threat of those lawsuits that needed to be dealt with right away. And so we really considered it a win, first, to stop that most immediate threat of severe economic devastation for farming here. The issue of the phase in of overtime is something that can continue to be worked on. And the farming community here, we're hoping for further concessions to show, farming operates differently than many other sectors. It's not like a factory making widgets. And there at least needs to be some kind of seasonality provision passed, and we're hoping to see that happen in the next legislative session in 2022, to recognize the fact that farming is different and to recognize the farm worker impact. At the root of all of this, and we haven't talked much about this, is the argument that this is supposed to be a good thing for workers, and that workers are being, left out in the cold economically by the situation here in Washington State. In most cases, that's absolutely backwards, where farm workers here in Washington State were taking advantage of the exemption that, as it existed until that court ruling last fall, to make more money and to maximize their income at the times when work is there. Make hay when the sun shines. And that's what they were doing. They embrace that lifestyle. That's the lifestyle of the farmer, of the farm worker. They live in that natural world that comes and goes. And, some days you're on and you're harvesting, and then the next day you get a big rain and you're taking a couple of days off. In the wintertime, you might go on vacation or travel or do something else. Summer or harvest time, or whenever the busy time is, you may be working, 60, 70 hours a week. But people in that world, as you know, tend to embrace that kind of a lifestyle, because that way they can make a lot of money when there's money to be made. Right now, farm workers are being restricted from making more money at those busy times of the year, because if you look at X amount of work that needs to be accomplished on a farm, farming is a low margin endeavor. You can't suddenly make that X amount of work cost, potentially 25, 30% more if time and a half has to be paid. So you bring in more workers, and you don't allow people to work overtime because you can't afford to pay, 50% more for that amount of work that's happening over 40 hours a week. So what happens to workers? They lose that opportunity to make good money when the work is available. And in the winter, when the work isn't available, what do they have? And it's been a big bummer for a lot of people. They've been very disappointed. I guess some people may say, well, the farmer should just pay that time and a half regardless. But most farms would go out of business if their labor costs increase that much. They're already to the breaking point with labor costs. And the bottom line is, workers are paid really well here in Washington State. There are a few farm workers who are making less than $16 to $17 an hour. Our minimum wage is already quite high here in Washington State, but because of the shortage of farm workers, because of things like the H-2A guest worker program that actually boost wages for a lot of workers in different sectors, farm workers are making $16, $17, $20 an hour in some cases, and with piece rate pay, which has also been a struggle and been under attack here in Washington legally for some years now. And there are people that can make $25, $30 an hour or more if they're very skilled at what they do, and they love to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, because I think a lot of people thought, oh, well, I go to my 9 to 5 every day and I come home and I make what I make. And, if the boss wants me to work more, well, then he's got to pay me more. And I think, it's not just agriculture. I think a lot of businesses purposefully don't have employees working overtime because they can't afford it. And that, that's the same with agriculture. And, we have a lot of fruit farms over here in Southwest Michigan and Northern Indiana. And these farm workers are some of the hardest working people ever. And you're right. If they have the work there and they can do it, they're going to do it, and they're going to keep working. And they also understand that sometimes you have a lot of things to do on the farm, and sometimes there's literally nothing. And so they understand that, and they're there and they're working and they're making their money. So it's unfortunate that in this situation, these people have supposedly tried to help them, have actually maybe hurt them.
Absolutely. And they have hurt them. And in fact, I've lived that experience myself. When I was a kid, that's what I was doing. I was working on the farm, granted my parents' farm, but I was essentially a farm worker in some ways, at least seasonally. And then, I went to college, started working in the corporate world and broadcast. Absolutely. There was no overtime permitted whatsoever. I remember one time in my 12 years, and I was only aware of this because I was in management in my later years there. There was one time where we had to pay overtime for an hour or two of someone. Otherwise, it was absolutely verboten. And there was gnashing of teeth just over that. And I was frustrated because I'm the farm kid saying, hey, if the whole overtime thing is a problem, could you just pay me straight time? I'm young, I want to work more hours. I was working in a newsroom, there was stuff to do. Nope, absolutely not. And it just, having been raised in that different system, boggled my mind and really put me at a disadvantage financially to be able to make money when I had the opportunity to do it.
Right. And I suppose there's probably a difference between someone who wants to work overtime and someone who doesn't, right? I mean, I guess I understand that, but I don't know that, at least my experience with some of these farm workers, they're not going to choose, I'm going to go, hang out this weekend. That's what they're here for. They're here to work, to make money and get the job done. So, first, tell me a little bit, like, what's the feeling in the ag community now with this legislation? Has the legislation been passed yet, or are we still waiting for that?
The legislation did pass with this phase in, and I should step back and say other states have and are doing similar phase ins, California, New York, and I know there are others as well. Washington is the only one that steps it all the way down to 40 hours a week. I think the closest is 48, and I can't remember which state that was in. But yeah, the governor signed that into law just within the past month, I want to say, as the session wrapped up in Olympia here in Washington. And so that time clock starts ticking, where January 1st of 2022, the first tier begins, where the threshold is at 55 hours, and any hours worked over 55 need to be paid time and a half. In 2023, it'll be 48 hours, and in 2024, it will go down to 40 hours a week. So that's already started, and again, it's been heralded by folks within that labor activist community that have pushed this so hard with, I will add, a lot of false information about how this is going to help workers, which doesn't jive with the reality. They've heralded, bringing the 40-hour work week to farming, and it's long overdue, decades overdue. Again, trying to force that like corporate cookie cutter onto farming. And what we're seeing is this is going to hurt the smallest farms the most. It's going to hurt family farms the most. The only ones that really can adapt to it the best are the large farms, the corporate kinds of farming, the same kinds of farming, which, depending on how they're done, I may or may not have an issue with, but certainly these activists always have an issue with and constantly rail against. They're actually giving them the advantage in this case, which is so bizarre. They're actually hurting the farm workers that they say they're helping, and they're giving advantage to the kind of farming that they say they don't like. So the outcome is totally backwards, and it really just makes you want to scream and say, come here and look at how things really work in this world. I understand that from your ivory tower, you think this is the way things work, and you're applying logic from your experience in a totally different realm, but it doesn't actually work that way in our world.
Right, exactly. And unfortunately, I think we see that a lot from these types of activists. They don't really understand agriculture or farming, and maybe they have good intentions, but we end up kind of in these situations.
Some do, and I think a lot of people involved with their movements do, but I think there are a few people, particularly in positions of power and organizing these things, that see the bigger picture. Sadly, I think some of them know what's really going on, but the bottom line is this ensures they still have a job. This means their union brings in more money or whatever it might be. So whether or not it actually benefits workers is secondary at best to them. And that's the ugly truth that a lot of people don't want to talk about and people really get uncomfortable with. But it's crazy, as they roll it out, they say, well, this will ultimately actually be good for farming and it'll attract more workers or different things like that. And it's like, you're gaslighting us. Like, you haven't lived our life, our experience, our lifestyle. You're trying to force a cookie cutter onto us, and then you're trying to tell us so we should actually be happy about it. It's crazy when you step back and look at the big picture.
Yeah, yeah. But we don't think it's broke, so I don't know why they're trying to fix what's not broke.
And the reality here in Washington State, there are still other sectors of our economy that enjoy an overtime exemption. Flight attendants, real estate agents, and there's a bit of a list of different people that overtime does not apply to for good reason. As you know, you look at like flight attendants, that's a ebb and flow kind of business. It makes sense potentially in their circumstances. I'm not intimately involved with it, so I can't make a legal argument for it. But now to say, well, farming has to abide by this, while others that are potentially less connected with the cycles of nature and markets and all these kinds of things enjoy that kind of an exemption, it's hypocritical in a lot of cases if that's undealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know that when I talk to my friends from Washington State, there's always concern about what's coming up next, what they're going to have to deal with, if they're going to be able to adapt to that and be profitable. So I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing, and having a voice and talking about these things fearlessly, and not mincing words. So I really appreciate that you guys are doing this work and sticking up for farmers out there, because I know I've told several of my friends that they need to move over here to Indiana and Michigan. It would be a lot easier for them, but unfortunately you can't pick up the farm and move it. So it is what it
and
is.
I think in a lot of ways we're the canaries in the coal mine, because this kind of ideology has an incubator in these metro area, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco. This is where, and generally, and not to overgeneralize, but a lot of folks who are increasingly very disconnected from farming have a lot of ideology, and they're a lot of ideals that they want to apply to something that they know very little about, and they like to run these things as test balloons to then spread that ideology, whatever their game is, like we've talked about, whether their motives are good or not, across the country after, giving it a test drive out here. So I think people across the country should be watching this kind of stuff very closely. And even here in Washington State, just the pressure of activism and protesters and things like that is so much stronger on this side of the Cascades, the west side of the Cascades. And I tell that, I travel a lot with my podcast, Real Food, Real People podcast, just to get a shameless plug in there. Travel a lot to Eastern Washington. I even tell those folks, like, watch out. I live over on the west side. There's a lot of people who don't know what farming is really like, and they have very strong views of what they're trying to push on the farming community. It's coming your way as well. Don't get too comfortable feeling like, oh, that's just something that's out in the big cities on the coast, because it won't just stay there. And part of that is, I think, rests on the farming community's shoulders to be able to tell its story, to be able to stand up for itself, and like I talked about earlier, to be able to expose the real motives behind some of the folks pushing these things. I think the pendulum has swung very far in the favor of activist groups, with social justice movements, environmental justice movements, etc. And as that is kind of the cause du jour, there's a big void of information or understanding about farming. And again, it's important to, yes, talk about what farming is really like, show what life on the farm is like. And it's not necessarily like the red barn you see behind me anymore. It involves technology. It involves a lot of really cool stuff. I think it's important that people understand that, and they realize that farmers are across the country primarily family farm operations still, whether they're large or small. I think that makes a fundamental difference in how a farm is operated. But then beyond all of that, they're real humans. It's not just a big, the man growing food as the narrative often goes, but then to expose the ulterior motives. And there are big dollars pushing this, as we've seen in so many different hot button issues in the last 10 years or more, where if you dig deep enough and follow the money, It's you see what's really going on. Well, it's the look at what's going on with meat right now, and fake meat and all of that. Who's really paying for those campaigns? It's the same thing on a lot of these issues. What we need is more people calling that out and showing, because the public cares about people being treated well, they care about animals being treated well, and they care about the environment being treated well. Well, who's really doing that? And who's stewarding the environment, taking care of employees, providing economic opportunity, taking care of animals, and who is harming them? And oftentimes it's these activist groups, these activist movements that are causing more harm than anything. And that needs to be exposed, and the public needs to see that.
Right.
And I think it's only at that point, once people can start to see that they realize what they're buying into isn't the good thing that they've been sold, the bill of goods that they've been sold.
Yeah. And I want to reiterate one thing that you said, because I think it's really important that we show people what we're doing on our farms, and we have, those nice posts and stories that we do. But at the same time, I think we have to be willing to step out and get behind policy and explain that policy to people. And I think that's kind of the key that we're missing right now, because all these other people have means of doing that, and it sounds really nice, and they use their great marketing techniques.
Right.
And if we're not doing that, then we're going to fall short there. So I think that's such a key component.
Well, and we need to be able to show not only are they wrong, but they're causing harm to things that the public holds dear by furthering those false narratives and bad agendas, and that they're really in it for money. As much as farming can be accused of that, you got just rich farmers trying to get more rich. Well, no, number one, rich farmer is mostly a myth, and two, these folks pushing these agendas, look at where they're bringing in money, whether it's grants, whether it's donations, whether it's legal fees. I mean, huge amounts of money are generated in this sector, and that's what they want to preserve and continue. So that's where we often say in the advocacy work we do here at Save Family Farming is, if we just come out and say, okay, well, the things that you said aren't really fully true, we're only one step of the way there. And in fact, we're just saying we aren't as bad as you say we are. And our view is you can't win an argument saying that. You have to show, a lot more than, well, we just aren't, as bad as they're accusing us of being. You have to show, no, we're the good guys in this equation, and expose who are the bad guys in this equation. Not just from our perspective, but from the public's perspective. What is that urbanite, again, that person who holds a lot of political power in our communities and our states, because that's where our big voting blocks are. What's their awareness, and what are they going to resonate with? Because they have a certain value system that we won't be able to change. They care, again, about these big three things that I just listed. We have to show not only what we're doing in a positive way for those, but how those things are being harmed by these folks pushing false narratives and anti-farm agendas.
Absolutely. And I think those things that you're mentioning, those are shared values, right? We farmers value those things, and so do the public. So exposing some of that underlying agenda and how these people are making a living from doing that, I don't think you see any farmers who are running nonprofits about attacking, whatever random thing is happening, and that's all they do.
Yep.
So,
but I feel that when we encounter these certain activist groups and we find out, just how false their narratives are, when we find out just how bad their ulterior motives are, and how much it's about money for them or their lawyers or whatever it might be, we need to be in the business of calling out and going on the counterattack and say, public, you need to see these folks are harming the good thing that is producing food here in America, and in many cases harming the environment, harming animals, and making it more difficult to take care of workers the best way. So I think people need to be forced to come to grips with that. It's not comfortable. The farming community in particular doesn't like to do it, because there's the general perspective of, life is crazy out there, especially in the big city. I'm out here on the farm. I'm just going to put my head down and keep farming. And I think the farming community across this country has done that now for decades. And I think it's catching up with us because we haven't had a face, we haven't had a voice, we've been dehumanized. The urban public has been convinced that food doesn't come from family farms anymore. It comes from the grocery store. It comes from giant corporations that don't care about your well-being, which isn't true. But there's been no counter narrative presented to show that that's false and also nefarious in its intent. And then beyond that, trying to think of, our philosophy of advocacy here. Not only is it scary to do that, but it's needed, but it actually provides protection for your farm, your farming community, when you step out and speak truthfully like that. Yes, is it a risk? Of course. And the blowback can be nasty, but not doing that, and this is the thing I often point out to people, is saying nothing is also saying something. It was one of the things that I was taught in communications 101 class in college. You're still communicating when you're not communicating. Well, we need to be real with that in the farming community. What are we communicating? We're communicating that we're actually guilty if we have no response. As a reporter, I experienced that. Something would go on, an accusation would be thrown out against farming. I'd call and try to get a response from the farming community. No one would say anything, no comment. I understand because people are scared. Well, my words are going to be taken out of context. They're going to be twisted. They're going to be used against me. But also saying nothing is going to be used against you. And that was often the assumption. Well, they must be guilty as charged because they have no response. And so we need to change the perspective. And I think the best defense is a good offense, to go and say, no, these people that are accusing us of something, look at what they're actually doing. Who's actually funding them? How are they getting rich off of this? And look how they're actually harming workers in the environment and animals. Yeah. It takes guts, though, to do that. And we aren't really able to do that as a farming community until we all work together. And that's, I guess, kind of my final point with this advocacy perspective, is we have to unify and start working together across sectors and perspectives. Even within the smaller differences that we have to recognize that this current time, the pressures we face are bigger than those things. We cannot go to our corners when one commodity group or sector of the farming economy is being attacked. We can't retreat to our corner and say, well, we don't want to get roped in on that. If we as a farming community speak out as one voice, we are incredibly powerful to get that message across. And so we need to start working together and supporting each other in this kind of pretty gutsy outreach, kind of public outreach effort to change this narrative. Otherwise, this is the big thing. All of the activist efforts result in more and more of our food being grown in other countries. And we need to get serious about that, because other countries aren't protecting the environment the way we are. Other countries are not protecting workers the way we are, animals, whatever it might be. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater and produce food here. And there are plenty of environmental reasons beyond that too, even just the carbon footprint of our food. If you really want to get real about that, you activists, let's produce our food here rather than make it so hard and costly that it's grown overseas.
Right, absolutely. Well, hopefully some people watching this will be inspired to action by your passion, and we'll see more of that advocacy that we desperately need.
Well, our organization is all about empowering farmers to speak out and not just having a PR hack like myself speak out, even though I feel kind of like a farmer still, but I'm not really, because I'm not doing it day to day. We want real farmers to speak out. And I will just say, from our experience here, as farmers do it, they're nervous. It's outside their comfort zone. They do it. Again, it's not easy, but they have seen great results. And the more people that are involved with this kind of approach here, the more believers we have in, no, I need to have the guts to stand up, speak out, and more people are willing to do it and work together. And I think the proof is really in the pudding there, as even news coverage and how that works. Suddenly if the farming community has a voice and a point person to coordinate that and get a farmer on the air to respond to something, suddenly the whole dynamic is changed. And we've, here in Washington State, seen news coverage change, because they know, those newsrooms know now we will be calling them. and saying, you got this wrong and you need to talk to this farmer. And oftentimes, again, I was in that business too. I know it's just because they're busy and who are they supposed to call? How do they get that farming perspective in front of people via our traditional media channels? We've got to do that. We've got to be available and have that face and that voice.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me about this and the update. I hope you will continue to let me know how it's going and how farmers in Washington State are faring. Hopefully no other big things will happen.
Fingers crossed. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on to talk about this and being interested in this stuff going on out here on the West Coast and the crazy things that we deal with out here. It's, a total honor to be on with you today, Amanda.
Oh, thank you.